So now that you have both shoulder seams sewn, one of the reasons we use a flat felt stitch for the shoulder seams for the Photinia top and dress is so that we can gather the neckline efficiently. It being flat allows us to not have to worry about too much bulk at the shoulder seams as we're stitching and putting our running stitches into place to gather the neckline. So I'm going to show you how to gather the neckline now. And if this irregular cut of the plaid is bothering you, please know that it bothers me too. Really mad that I didn't get that pattern matching there, but we're just gonna ignore it anyways. So I'm going to teach you how to gather the neckline by using a running stitch, and we will go from there. So we're gonna start on at one shoulder seam, and then we're gonna go, whichever direction is more comfortable for you. For me, when it comes to handling my fabric or the direction that I want to hold it, I always hold it with where I can hold the edge of the fabric. I don't like to hold this side when I'm working just because it can be fiddly. I like to hold the edge with my left hand so that I can control and manipulate the stitching with my right, and then manipulate tension with my left of the fabric. So manipulate tension of the fabric. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hold this area with my left hand, and then I'm going to put my gathering stitches along here using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to stitch 2 lines of basting stitches along the edge of the neckline. And so I'll show you how I do that. You have 2 options here. You can use a sashiko needle. It's just a very large needle that allows you to be able to do the running stitches more effectively. You can do that and then use a sashiko thimble to push it through back and forth. Or you can just use a regular needle like we've been using, and then you can singularly, pick each stitch. You'll have a little more control over your stitching with either one, really. It just depends on the method that you want to do it. For this, you're going to want to use a long amount of thread. It's just the nature of the beast here. If you want to use elbow length, then you can. If you want to keep it attached to the spool of the fabric, then you can. If you use elbow length, you're not going to have enough to do the full round. So I like to use a pretty long amount, and then I'm just careful so as not to have any tangling. I'm just watching the way that I'm stitching here. So I did about 5 elbows lengths long of thread. It's a pretty large amount, and that's just so I can work efficiently. I'm not going to beeswax this. I am just going to leave it the way it is and then deal with it as we go. So you're just single threading here. There is absolutely no need to double thread your needle here unless you just really, really want to. I actually am going to beeswax the beginning of my thread here just so I can have some control. And so now we're going to get started. The instructions tell you to begin to do 2 lines of stitching. Sewing instructions tell you to do 2 lines of stitching on either side of the neckline. So what I mean by that is it tells you to do 2 lines of stitching on this side of the neckline, and then do another 2 lines on this side of the neckline. What we're going to do is we're just going to baste or running stitch 2 lines of stitching all the way around, starting here and then ending back here at the end. So that's what we can do to start off. What I'm going to do is measure a 1/4 of an inch. I can pretty much eye that, but I just want to make sure. Okay, so that's there. I'm a little uneven here, but that's okay. And what I'm doing is I'm just anchoring this stitch so that when I come back around, it doesn't come loose while I'm gathering. Again, you have to decide how much fiddling you want to do with this as you go. You might even do like I did and just pull out your first stitch. I am going to go ahead and do this and then come back to you. So you want to go ahead and anchor the beginning of your stitching. That way when you're gathering, nothing comes loose and everything's okay. And I'm just putting 3 stitches in the same spot to anchor my thread. Linen thread's pretty forgiving, but cotton thread will definitely tangle as you do this, so just move very carefully. Okay, so now we're going to gather. The way that we're going to gather, we're just going to use a running stitch. We're going to use small running stitches because we want a controlled gather around so that it's even and it doesn't look wonky for your gathered neckline. So we're going to use 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch between stitches, and that looks like this. And I'm using a sashiko needle. Because we're using smaller stitches, I just realized that it might be better for me to use a regular stitching method instead of using the sashiko needle. So the sashiko thimble, so I'm not going to use this. And then I'm just going to pull. Now you can gather as you go, and you'll see that when you're doing stitches by hand for gathering, you get a nice controlled stitch. So if you want to gather as you go, you can. I'm still going to do my 2 lines of basting stitches just so I don't have to worry about fiddling with it later on. And I know how much control I have instead of, trying to make it work for me as I go. So you see my distance between stitches is about 1/4 of an inch between them all. Just go carefully here and try to make your stitches uniform so that there's not a lot of spacing between them or one stitch is longer than the other. I have them pretty consistent, but as you can see, I started off a little smaller here and then got bigger, so I'm going to go smaller as I go. And then we'll come back here and then we'll do the second line of stitching and then we'll gather. All right, so our neckline is gathered now. As you can see, well, it's not fully gathered, but we do have our basting stitches in place so that we can gather. So I have 2 lines of basting stitches all the way around. As you hand sew, I don't know that I completely kept a consistent first and line of basting stitches 1/4 and 3/8 of an inch away from the edge, but I tried to get close, and we can always remove the basting stitches later after we have sewn in the neck binding. So what we are going to do now is we are going to pull the gathering stitches so that we can gather the neckline, and it's really simple. We're just going to pull the stitches. And you want to pull the tail because you left, you should have
anchoring stitches here, and then a tail next to your anchoring stitches, so you can pull from different directions for both the front and the back. And I'll tell you why in a second, but first we're going to just start by pulling and gathering. And you'll know if you have some even stitches by the way your gathers look. And this is pretty good. So we have some even, nicely formatted gathers. There's no gaps between. There's not one is bigger than the other. And so we're just going to keep pulling and gathering. You'll also know if you made your stitches too small, because it'll be difficult to gather your neckline. So, and you're pretty much going to do that till you get to the other side. Now, I'm going to distribute these evenly in 1 second after I gather both sides. And then I'm going to tell you in a second why we split these up. You may see that you have some knots somewhere. If you find that and it's difficult to gather, then, just work with it. Try not to be rough depending on what type of thread you're using. You don't want to rip the thread, because then you'll have to go back and regather all over again. And that wouldn't, maybe it'd be fun. I'm not sure. It depends on who's doing it. But I know for me, I don't want to regather all of this all over again. So the reason that we have the gathering stitches going 2 different directions is because we have a front and the back. And so again, you can tell, we talked earlier, you can tell which is the back by which way your seam is facing. And so this part is the back for me. I want the back. I've made this several times, so I pretty much know how I like my neckline to fit. If you want it looser and you want it lower, then you want to distribute your gathering stitches a little looser and not so much together as they are here. So you want to loosen them up a little bit and spread them out a little bit more. For your back though, and I've already done this prematurely just by instinct and habit, is that you want it higher, of course, so that when you match up your shoulder seams like this together, your back neckline should be a little higher than your front neckline, so that it's kind of a classic scoop neck design look. And then the back sits higher on your neck so that it's holding it in place, so it doesn't shift back and forth on your body. So you want to gather a little bit more tighter in the back, but then you have freedom to be kind of as loose as you want in the front, depending on what your preference is. If you want it higher on the neck or lower on the neck, that's up to you. You just want to make sure that you keep the back neckline at least 1 inch to 2 inches higher than your front neckline. So what that looks like when I say that is like, it's about 1.5 inches higher than my front neckline laying down. So just keep that in mind. If you are looking at the sewing instructions, then there is a page in the sewing instructions that details how to distribute your gathers evenly. You have some options here too. I like them distributed all around evenly, but if you don't like any gathers in your armpit, or that bothers you to have any drag lines in your armpit, then you want to gather away from the arm. So I haven't fully gathered this, so this is kind of an example. You're going to leave this kind of like this, and then distribute your gathers closer to the center instead of all the way around if you don't like drag lines close to your underarm. The arm side or opening width for this pattern, I left it pretty loose, especially for the sleeved version. So you shouldn't have too many issues having something under your arm or feeling the fabric under there uncomfortably. But, if you just don't like the way that looks, then again, you can distribute the gathers closer to the center and then leave some, just space like this closer to the shoulder seam and the underarm area, excuse me. So we can just distribute evenly, which is what I've done. And then you want to go to the mirror, check it, make sure it fits you good, make sure it's sitting where you want it to. And then we're going to move on to the neckline binding and putting the binding on. Of course, if you only have the elastic neck band, which I believe is view D, size D, then you would just follow the instructions on the sewing tutorial that I have on my website blog, and then you can see how to insert the elastic, and you won't need to do any of these steps, but this is how to gather the neckline, and now we're going to move on to the binding. Okay, so once you've fitted it and checked it for where you like it to sit, you want to pay attention to where you liked it, and then kind of maneuver. The tricky part at this point, especially since these are hand gathers and not machine gathers, so they're a little looser and easier to come undone, is keeping the gathers in place. And so what you want to do is after you found the right spot that you want it at least in length, we can distribute more later. What we want to do though is keep the length that we like. That's the most important part. So, because we don't want it to, shift and then be too big or too small by the time we try it on and finish the binding. So in order to keep it in place, I like to tie the tails of my gathering stitches off, tie them in place. And you can, do this multiple ways. I mean, I just double knot it, but also sometimes I will do it this way, which is probably better to keep it more secure. But I just tie the tails off in place once it's at the best measurement that I like. And then I distribute the gathers later when I'm attaching and basting on the binding, because that's going to be the most important time. And so now you can easily, distribute the gathers more to where you would like them, centered or not, while also not losing any gathering stitches in the process. You can move them around freely without losing your gathering stitches. So do that for the front and back. If you have some issues keeping everything in place, that should help you not lose any of the stitching that you did and not have to start over. Okay, so now we're going to measure the neckline so that we can have a decent binding size that fits the neckline perfectly. And so what we're going to do is we're going to bring up, this is how I measure the neckline. If you have a better way, then of course you can use that way for yourself. But we're going to bring up the neckline so that they're equally together. So remember how we had the back neckline is higher than the front. Well, we're not worried about the shoulder seams, being in the center or anything. We're just aligning and making sure the necklines are equal and together. So after we've done that, then we're going to measure the neckline opening with a ruler. You can use a measuring tape as well. I'm just using what's around here. And then we're going to measure in the neckline. We're of course going to times this by 2, whatever number we get, because we have a front and a back. And so the amount I am getting for here looks like it's about 11 inches. So we're going to times it by 2. 11 times 2 is 22. 22 plus we're going to add the seam allowance to the neck binding, which puts us at about 23. So because we have to times the seam allowance by 2 as well, since we're sewing 2 pieces together for the ends. So we are going to do 22 inches for our neck binding, 23 inches for the neck binding. So you take the neck binding, find it, times it by 2. You take the neckline measurement, times it by 2, and then add an inch for seam allowance, and that is your neck binding amount. I like to give just a little bit extra just in case the gathering stitches shift, but that is of course up to you. And so I'm going to use a ruler here. And then of course what you want to do is, unless you plan to join the ends a certain way diagonally, I'm just going to go ahead and snip this triangle piece off for the end there so that I can just sew a seam. You will have, of course, if you do the continuous binding, you'll have this diagonal piece here. If you want to cut your excess diagonally, then you can join those together without having any waste whatsoever. For the purposes of this video, I'm just cutting off the triangle piece. So we're going to go here, and then I'm going to, we'll do 11.5, and then I'm going to come this way, and that puts us here. So I'm probably going to cut in the middle of this triangle. And actually, I feel like 22 inches is a little too small, so I'm probably going to widen it a little bit more, and then I'm just going to cut this neckline larger so I can accommodate it. But that is basically it for how to cut your neck binding piece. And then I'm going to adjust my neckline, and then I'll come back and show you how to sew it on. Okay, so to get started sewing our binding, we're first going to connect the ends. We're going to do right sides together. We're going to attach the ends of the binding first. And if you have pieces from the continuous binding construction, then those of course are going to be the wrong side. And then, you know, your good side is going to be the right side. So we're just going to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then we're going to stitch down. We're going to stitch down the short end. And then after that, I'll show you what to do next. Okay, so now that we've sewn our binding short ends together, I used a backstitch, as you can see here. Bindings are not my favorite thing to sew, so it may be a little wonky. But I sewed using a backstitch. If you use a very small running stitch, you can achieve the same outcome. It just won't have as strong of a seam, but that's really not that bad since it'll be attached to the neckline. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press the seam, finger press the seam open, and then I'm going to, with right sides together, and make sure you're pressing your seams open too for your binding cutout area. I didn't press this out, so it's going to be a little weird, but what I can do is do that. And so make sure you press out all your seams. Make sure you cut any areas that may be a little iffy. Since it is continuous bias binding, there's some seams in random areas. So just cut all those. And then what you're going to do is you're going to right sides together. You're going to fold the binding in half here. Now my binding is a little shorter. I cut mine, this is 3.5 inches, I believe, of binding that I have here. Yeah, 1.5 times, it's actually 3 inches of binding. So I updated the instructions so that it's 4 inches instead of 3.5 like it previously was. So you should be able to see that. So mine is going to actually come out a little bit shorter than it would for you. Just keep that in mind. So yours should be cut at 4 inches wide. So it's going to be a little bit wider than this, just FYI. Just wanted to let you know that there. So once you've folded it in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, then we're going to attach it onto our top. And to do that, we're going to match center backs, and everything else. So you want to make sure your right side's out. And you want your back on top. So our back is on top. So want to make sure again that all of your gathering stitches are even like you would like them, because now we're about to sew the binding onto the actual garment, and we can't fix it once it's on. We'd have to take it apart again. So make sure it is to the width and everything that you like, and to distribute the gathers the way that you would want them to sit if you were wearing it. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to take our binding, we're going to attach it, we're going to attach the seam center back to the center back of the actual garment. I'm eyeing this because I am lazy, but for you, you can just simply fold the sides in half, find the center back. To me, that looks about here, and so that's where I'm going to attach it. I'm going to attach it using some pins. And I'm going to use them, I'm going to put them sideways so that it's easier for me to maneuver everything. And so the gathers stay in place and don't shift as I play around with this neckline. Okay, so now your neckline is attached, and you've pinned around the circumference of the neckline. So what you're going to do now is you're going to backstitch, and I do mean backstitch because if you use a running stitch, it's not going to be as tight as you would want it to hold those gather stitches in place. So you're going to backstitch around the edge of the neckline. You want to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the neckline, because then we're going to trim it. For me, I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance just because my neck binding is smaller than I would like it to be because I didn't alter it. But yeah, just go ahead and backstitch around the edge of the neckline, that 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then we'll come back here and go to the next step. So now that we've sewn our binding to our neckline, as you can see, and here's just a close-up view of how that looks. I just backstitched around it, and some of my gathering stitches, my basting stitches, are still here. I've taken out most of them, but some of them are still here. I also wanted to address, when you're stitching through all the layers, make sure you're catching your back layers. This is like one of 3 stitches I missed, but there's another one, but just keep that in mind to make sure that you're checking the back area on the wrong side to make sure that you're picking up the fabric there. I'm gonna just leave these basting stitches here. I don't really care about them that much. And so I'm gonna move on to the next step, which is folding the binding over and then slip stitching it in place. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply fold this binding piece over, and if you want to trim the seam allowance, you can. I sewed this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, as I explained before, because my binding was a little smaller due to previous unaltered areas of the pattern I didn't change. And so if you want to just fold over the binding to the wrong side so that it overlaps your seam allowance. So here's your seam allowance. You're going to fold over the binding so that it overlaps. And so then you can kind of see the neckline kind of taking more shape as you go. And then from the back, it'll look like this, or from the right side, it'll look like this. What you want to do is you want to pin from the outside to keep this in place. Now, in order to sew your binding to the neckline fully and finish it off, you have one of two options. You can fold over your binding, pin it in place from the right side, and then you can backstitch along the right side, catching the inner folded over edge, and then continuing around, backstitching it in place. Alternatively, you can use this side, stitch this area in place, and then slip stitch the binding in place. Similar, if you're familiar with quilting, then you'll know how to do this slip stitching, but you would slip stitch the binding in place along the inside. So the back stitching, I think, is pretty much self-explanatory. If you wanted to do that, you would just stitch in the ditch here from where you have your pins set. So wherever you stuck your pins, you'll follow along that line and then backstitch along the ditch as you go along the neckline. If you don't want to do that and you want to slip stitch because you want an easier stitching experience, then I'm going to show you how to slip stitch your binding in place instead of back stitching it. So here we go. So as you can see, I've pinned my binding to my neckline on the inside. So if you're back stitching, you'll pin on the outside so that you can stitch on the outside. Since we're slip stitching on the inside, then we've pinned on the inside to hold our binding in place. So to begin slip stitching, I've knotted my thread at the end just to hold it in place. If you want to do the classic anchor stitch, then you can. To hold your stitching in place doesn't matter. You just want to make sure your thread is stationary and not moving as you slip stitch. So I prefer to knot in this case just for this next step. And so this next step is that we're going to bring the needle in and come out at the top of the crest of the fold. And so we pull out there, and then that's how we start our slip stitch in this situation. And so we're going to now pretty much do the movements of a whip stitch a little bit. We're going to pick up tiny bits of fabric, excuse me. We're going to pick up tiny bits of fabric as we sew, then come through the fold of the binding, and then come out, pick up tiny bits of fabric, then come through the fold of the binding again, and continue onward throughout our neckline. So what that looks like is I've already pulled it through the fold, and so now I'm going to pick up a tiny, make sure I don't get too close. We're going to pick up a tiny bit of fabric here, and then come in through the fold. And that is our first slip stitch. I'll show you that one more time. I'm going to pick up, and the closer you move your binding to your seam allowance, the more of a reliable area of fabric you'll have to pick up. So we go in, we're picking up, and it's behind the fold that we're picking up fabric, so it's closer to our seam allowance. So if I'm going to lift up this binding here, you can kind of see where I'm picking up fabric. I'm picking up a tiny bit of fabric here, and then coming through the fold and out again to slip stitch in place. That's our second slip stitch. So you're going to continue doing that around the full width, full circumference of the neckline binding just until you are finished. And then your neckline binding is complete, and you can move on to the next step after you've done that. So I'm going to do a few more slip stitches here so you can see what it looks like. When it comes to width of these, you can kind of wing it a little bit. They don't need to be too close. It depends on your preference, actually. If you want a more secure binding, of course, you can make them closer together, but there's nothing wrong with alternating widths. You may want to do one longer stitch after every 3 small stitches. It goes pretty fast, slip stitching, I will say. So, it doesn't really matter how long or how much how small you make your stitches. It really just depends on how secure of a binding you want to your garment. And so the smaller you make your stitches, the more secure the binding will be. Just keep that in mind. But I'm making mine about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch away from each other, just to be sure, because I don't want to come back here and have to restitch it if it comes apart. Also, I recommend, of course, starting at the center back of your garment so that you have a place, a starting reference point and an ending reference point. Though it doesn't really matter, you'll come back to your stitching once you're finished stitching all the way around. So we're now going to move on to the next step. After we finish this, I'll show you the finished result, and then we'll go to the next step, which is our side seams. So I finished my whip stitching, and I'm just going to show you how to end it. So I've made it back to the beginning of my whip stitches. I've made it back to the beginning of my slip stitching, and I've finished. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to make one final slip stitch and show you how I finish it off. I finish it off by making some stationary stitches in the same spot over and over again. It's pretty much making a slip stitch over and over in the same space. And I do about 3 or 4 of those, and then I knot. And I probably do 2 knots just to be safe, since this is my binding. But after that, then I go ahead and snip off. And voila, that is my finished neckline with bias binding finish. And again, if you did the backstitch option from the outside, then you should have some back stitches along the inner folded seam on the wrong side as you go along, because you edge stitched along the stitched in the ditch for the binding. So just keep that in mind, but that is how it looks when you slip stitch the binding in place. When you're doing the gathers for the cuff, you're going to do the gathers exactly like you did the gathers for the neckline. When you're putting on the cuff, you're going to back stitch it just like you back stitched the binding onto the neckline. And then you're going to fold over the cuff
And then you can choose to slip stitch the binding for the cuff onto the fabric, or you can backstitch from the outside to put the cuff on.